So this is syntactic analysis, and we're looking at syntax specifically. And these acronyms, there's also two that are from the discourse field, but they'll be useful to actually to make a really close syntactic analysis of an analytical commentary and develop that skill, because regardless of what text type you're looking at, syntax will always be an element and it's something you can speak to. So your job basically is you're going to create a cheat sheet of metalanguage. Some of it can be acronymized because it's a big long list of things that all string together, and some of it can't. So these videos will cover those things that you can actually use, and at least at the beginning you'll be wanting to use these acronyms to help you revise, help you to recall these things. The goal is that in the exam you won't be using these necessarily or need to rely on them, but sort of that it's kind of like training wheels, and that it gives you something to hang your knowledge off and to help you recall it later on. So as you're using your retrieval practice to memorize these things and their meanings, they might be useful for that. Due to the limited space of each slide, my definitions aren't as detailed as yours might like to be, so just keep that in mind and always be using the textbook to make sure, because that's the definitions that are sort of accepted for this course. So you're going to develop your own table in this respect. I've done the first three for you to get you started, but your job is to, for each element of the acronym, write a definition, a function, and then if you can find an example, the more real world, the better, because then any real world examples you use that you think are really good, you can then prepare for your expository essay. Section C. So first, SVO is of course subject, verb, object. That's pretty straightforward, so I'm not going to define it. Okay, so we've got NECS, which is nominalization, ellipses, coordination, and subordination. So again, all syntactical things. Nominalization, basically you're replacing a verb with a noun, used very commonly in essay writing. If you're in mainstream English, that'd be something that you'd be working on to develop your passive voice and to sort of increase the complexity of it by making sort of agentless passive voice in your sentences. Ellipses, of course, just removing things that are unnecessary. Coordination is sentence clauses like that. Subordination is like that. So one's the main, one is the subordinate. Then we've got SOCA, subject, object, complement, adverbial. So subject's the main thing, object is the thing that receives the thing, complement gives a bit of additional information, and an adverbial adds meaning to the verb. So just little, this sort of, you could also maybe use predicate as well, but just when you're writing about syntax, it's easier to say the subject of the sentence, the object, the complement, the adverbial. Makes it a lot more specific, as well as line numbers, of course, to support your point. So PCS, phrase, clause, sentence. So just thinking of chunks, basically. Phrase is a little bit, a clause is, a full SVO, basically. It can be independent or dependent. And then a sentence is a full thought in a sentence. So again, these are important to be really specific about what you're speaking about when you're writing about syntax. 2 S's, 3 C's. So 2 S's, 3 C's. Sentence fragment, simple sentence, compound sentence, complex, and compound complex. This one definitely you'll need to pause rather than me give a poor explanation of it. You want to be quite precise about these specific categories, because you definitely don't want to be misappropriating a sentence type for a sentence that it's not, as that would come across quite poorly. So make sure you're quite precise in these definitions, and so check the Orange Book to make sure you've got it in a way that you understand it. So this is from the discourse section, LAP, but it's also useful, of course, discourse means the whole text, but it's looking across sentences, so I feel like it's worthy to look at here, because the use of these acronyms is that you'll be analysing the syntactical elements of texts to really build up that skill and to get really strong in using this metalanguage specifically. So of course we've got listing, antithesis, and parallelism. Listing is what it sounds, dot points, or a series of commas breaking up different examples. Antithesis is the opposite, and parallelism is basically across two sentences where you do a similar thing. So you either do similar words or similar sequence or something like that, and it kind of makes a pair. So the good, the bad, the ugly, something like that, where you've sort of got a series of clauses that kind of are parallel related to one another. All right, active voice, passive voice, agentless passive. So that's an L in the middle, in between the A and the P. Active voice, I kicked the dog. Passive voice, the dog was kicked by me. And agentless passive, the dog was kicked. So obviously you've taken the agent out of it. The person who did the thing is now missing in agentless passive. And this can be used to obfuscate, can be used to make things seem more formal. There's a whole range of purposes for it, but it's very common in formal political discourse especially. So we've got FFEFEW, which is front focus, end focus, and end weight. So again, this is from discourse, but as it occurs sort of within the sentence level, it's useful to talk about in a syntactic analysis. So front focus basically means the juicy part is at the start of the sentence. End focus means it's at the end. End weight is a principle. I don't necessarily think it's in the meta-language list, but it's basically in English. English is typically an end weight language. So that means typically the end of the sentence is the juicy part. If you even just think of the dog was kicked by me or something like that, the focus is the end bit kind of brings the punch. So to use front focus, fronting, or pre-posing is sort of usually used for effect, mostly to entertain, to draw attention to things, to emphasize. It sort of has a series of effects. Okay, I die is our 4-sentence types, 4-sentence classes, 4-sentence purposes are probably best. So we've got interrogative, declarative, imperative, exclamative. Interrogative, asking questions. Declarative, saying things. Imperative is giving an order, and exclamation is basically swearing, yelling, oh, kind of things that sort of explode out of the human being rather than things that you logically think about. So I'm going to stop talking, but this is your retrieval practice. The idea is as they pop up, your job is to try and think about what they stand for, to try and make the connection between nothing and your memory, that you're trying to strengthen the pathway between your brain and the memory of the meta-language we're using. So PCS from syntax, SPCA from syntax, 2 S's, 3 C's from syntax, LAP from discourse, AP, VP, ALP from syntax, FFEFEW from discourse, SVO from syntax, NECS from syntax, and I die. Okay, discourse, so you're basically thinking you're looking at the entire text for these ones. Again, definitions, these are my quick ones off the top of my head, giving you a quick example. Your job is to use the Orange textbook to make sure your definitions are really precise, because of course on the exam short answer questions especially, you want to be using it exactly correct. And of course when you're using it in context in section B and C, you'll need to be specific. These acronyms, some of them are ugly, some of them are memorable, some of them are good, some of them are bad. Think of them as sort of training wheels that you'll phase out as you get better. You're going to make your own table, acronyms, meta-language, definition, function, and an example. The better your example, the easier things will be going forward, B and C, as you'll have examples in front of you that you can actually use. So these are all elements of cohesion. Okay, self-C is the thing that we use for cohesion, and cohesion itself just means sort of sticking together. Inference is when you can, from the context of the text, so not explicitly stated information, but things that you can work out from context or from prior knowledge. Logical ordering, think of an essay, you typically do TEAL, or for English we do FEE, or we do PQE. These are sort of structures that we use to make information easier to understand. Formatting, just think of a newspaper without the structural elements, the dividing separate articles into separate columns, the sort of title at the top, date down the bottom, pictures with captions, all those sort of things. Formatting that kind of helps us understand things and the way they sort of flow naturally. Consistency, umbrella term, for a range of features, basically similar words, similar domain, similar semantic field, similar sentence type, sentence structures, the things that make a text appear consistent. It's not going off on tangents and talking on different topics, it's consistent to itself. Conventions, sort of just the way the things are set out and the kind of writing that makes up them. Okay, so as we just said, cohesion is the sticking together of elements. And these are the things we use to memorize those elements. So LC cache is lexical choice plus cache. So collocation, words that go together in combinations, choc chip, fish and chips, salt and pepper, those sort of things that always go in combinations. Antonymy, words that mean the opposite. Synonymy, words that are related to one another. Hyponymy, as we've talked about before, you've got your superordinate or your hypernym at the top. Hyper means over, hypo means under. Hyponymy is sort of fitting within a category. Okay, so this is probably the most complicated acronym we've got, cohesion, and these are information flow, which is sort of how the information is presented. The acronym we've got is CAFE, C, cadres. A cadre is a a collection of cadets or new trainees in the army. Cafes where you get your coffee, and the C is just hanging out in the middle. Clefting, splitting a sentence. There's two types of clefting, but you will need to check the orange textbook for that specifically. But it's basically turning a sentence and taking the clause out and turning it into a sentence of itself, basically. Anaphoric is basically, I try and think of, if you imagine a text, I would write A and C, and A is referring back up to the top, and C is referring down to the bottom. So anaphoric is referring to something that's already been covered. So Stephen Colbert is a teacher, he is tall. So the he is referring back to the top. Cataphoric being the opposite. So we had a teacher, we later learned his name was Mr. Colbert. So the referent, or the reference, is going down, basically, is how I remember it. Front focus, we've talked about that elsewhere, is moving the focus of the sentence to the front. End focus is typically how our sentences go. The key information is at the end. Conjunction, connect things together using clauses. You can add the fanboys in there for a range of conjunctions that you can memorize: for, and, but, nor, those sort of things. Adverbials add a little bit more information, essentially. Deictics is a tricky one, but it's basically when from the context it's not entirely clear what it was. So if you read on a piece of paper, grab that pen, unless you're in the room looking at me pointing at a pen, you probably have no idea. So that's deixis or deictics. Repetition is repeating the same thing. Ellipsis, taking out unnecessary information. And substitution is replacing one element with another one. So pronouns would be an easy example, probably adding acronyms later on, like you might say the Program for International Student Assessment, full, and then say PISA, and from then on you call it PISA, or the test, or the study, or those sort of things, as sort of substituting the noun for an alternative to keep it sort of interesting. All right, these are our features of spoken discourse. So we've got deep, dippet, and APOC, D-P-I-T, A-P-O-C. Not the best. Discourse particles are your ums, your ahs, your ers, or I don't know, or sort of, I don't know, like whatever. Interrogative tags are sort of when you say a phrase. So I really love Chinese food. Do you also love Chinese food? Turns my phrase into a question. Adjacency pairs. How are you? Good. Good, thanks. How was your day? Good. How about you? Just sort of things that always go together. If you can break the rules and make sort of, if I say how are you and you actually tell me how you are, that's basically not an adjacency pair, but it's an expected response. Openings and closings. Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. The famous end of a speech closing for all students for some reason. So these are our spoken discourse non-fluency features, like I just did one then. You've got pauses. These can be for purpose or just by accident, as you think of an example. Filled pauses, repetition is sort of, you go or like, or wait, holding the floor using repetition. False start is when you say. So all of these are about meta-language. No, sorry, not meta-language. Let me go back to the start. These are all spoken discourse. So you're sort of false starting, and a repair is what I just did. So you're going back and fixing it up, and you're saying, or forget that, or that's off the record, or something like that, as a way to repair the error that you made. Tricky one. MRBPTT Probably the acronym's not going to work for this one, but hey, this is what we've got. Minimal response or back channeling. Yeah, right, gotcha. Yep, yep. So as someone else is talking, you're kind of encouraging them. You're saying, yeah, I'm paying attention. As a married man, these are very important that I use when my wife is speaking. Interesting. Oh, okay, right. To show that I'm alert. Turn taking, holding, and passing the floor. They're all pretty self-explanatory, but ways that you sort of take the floor. And topic management is how you keep to the same topic or how you change it. So by using topic management, using the phrase, yeah, that's interesting. And how about your work is sort of one way that you can pivot. So that's you managing the topic. Okay, LAP, you've got listing, antithesis, parallelism. So listing, dot points, series of commas, breaking up clauses, different little examples of things. I like eating, running, jogging, jumping, punching, or a dot point list of those. Antithesis is kind of a juxtaposition. You're contrasting two things. I love to work, but I hate weekends, or something that's a terrible example. Parallelism is where you do very similar things across two different paragraphs or two different sentences rather. So something like, it was a good day, it was a bad day. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Parallelism is sort of that, copying the structure of one another to make a nice little parallel, a nice little connection across sentences. Right, front focus, and end weight. End weight is sort of just a theory. End weight is generally, English is an end weight language, the same way it's a SVO language. You tend to put the important information at the end. Front focus is doing the opposite of that, where you put, for effect usually, you put the most important part of the information at the front. End focus is the opposite of that. All right, retrieval practice. Put all your notes away, grab a piece of paper, see if you can recall any of the elements of these acronyms as we go through them. SILF CC, LC Cash, Cafe C Cadres, and LA. FFEFE, DPITAPOC or DIPIT APOC, Mr. BPTTTHPTM, probably the worst acronym I've come up with. Okay, phonetics and phonology, these ones are pretty easy. Most of them are pretty intuitive to understand. As always, don't trust my definitions, they're short to fit on a slide and to sort of be said pretty quickly. And these acronyms are useful mostly at the beginning of your study, but less so later on, hopefully as you become more confident in the meta language, how to use it, how to locate it, and how to embed it in your essay writing specifically. You're going to write your own table, acronym, meta language, definition, function, and then spend as much time as you can finding actual in the wild example of that feature. It will make it a lot easier when you come to expository. Okay, prosodic features, bit B, these are all pretty straightforward. Stress is where you put the emphasis. When you say something really important, you might underline it with a little bit of stress, a little bit of strain, a little bit of high, low pitch. Pitch, how high, how low. So, hello, my name's Stephen. I'm a bit nervous today, but thank you for listening to me. And I'm also very professional and highly important. Intonation, basically the rhythm. So high rising terminal sort of fits within intonation. High rising intonation, perhaps. Tempo, how quickly you go, and volume, how loud you go. Pretty straightforward. Vocal effects, I haven't even defined them because they're what they sound like: cough, laugh, breath. These are all phonological features, but they're also part of prosody as well, I guess. Okay, sounds in connected speech, so EAVI or ERV. We've got elision, removal of a sound, get a, wouldn't, couldn't, shouldn't. Assimilation is where your neighbouring sounds affect the actual sound. So instead of saying handbag, most of us would say something like handbag when we're talking quickly and in a rush. Vowel reduction is where your vowels become weakened or de-emphasized, and usually they become a schwa. A schwa is sort of just like so for example, was becomes was. So sort of the vowel, rather than doing the full heightening and the actual pronunciation, it sort of just becomes was, do. Instead of do, we say do, and those sort of things. It's just, and apparently the schwa makes up about 30% of our language. The amount of sounds that we make, 30% of them are just the schwa, and in Australian English it's especially common and important because I guess it's sort of the, seems almost like the least effort way of making a vowel sound. So the kind of higher register, formal British accent is quite precise with its vowels, but Australians use, pretty much just drop the vowel and weaken it to a schwa. Insertion is adding sounds where they don't belong, so athletic and those sort of things. Phonological patterning in text, we get ra, ra, and ko. So rhyme was rhyme, the ending, so kind of cat, hat, mat, pat. So it's the ending of the word that's being rhymed. Alliteration is the first consonant, so Stephen should stop saying silly sounds. Same consonant at the start. Rhythm, stressed and unstressed patterns, so that's how you make rhythm basically. Assonance, repetition of vowel sounds, so hut, shut, mut, cut, it's the vowel that's being repeated, and the consonants is a subset of alliteration, so basically Stephen should stop saying silly words, or a lot of tongue twisters are consonants. And then automatopoeia is just sound imitation words, zip, pop, crack, and you know that they're onomatopoeic because they're different in different countries, as we know. So the wolf is what we hear dogs say, but in different cultures they hear different sounds, and that's how you know it's not an actual rule that's being followed, but it's sort of people trying to use their kind of phonemes that they have in a way that makes sense to their context. All right, retrieval practice. Your job is just to get the information that you just learnt out, So put your grid away, put your prepared notes, put the textbook away, sit in front of a blank piece of paper, write down these acronyms and see if you can kind of unpick what meta-language is attached. So SPIT-V, CBL, EAVI, and RA and CO. Alrighty, morphology and lexicology. So again, these are my quick definitions, snappy off the top of my head and sort of written out to fit on a slide rather than detailed. So you want to be using the orange textbook at all times to double check and to have a much more precise definition than my lazy teacher example. And the acronyms, think sort of training wheels. You probably won't need them in the end of your exam, but they're sort of to get you to recall and practice bringing out the knowledge that you have in your head. So your own table, of course, as with the others. So you probably honestly don't need an acronym for this one. You should just sort of memorize these from Unit 1 and 2, or at least put into practice memorizing them because this acronym sucks, obviously. NAV, AM, APIC, PD, so that's terrible. But nouns, adjectives, verbs, which includes auxiliaries and modal verbs, which is sort of an addition for Unit 3 and 4. Auxiliary verbs change some aspect of the main verb. Modal verbs show possibility, likelihood. Someone's asking you out on a date. Maybe I could, should I, maybe, perhaps I will, rather than yes, I'll see you there. The only ones we need to talk about, determiners, a, and, the, my, your, her, his, all those ones. The rest are pretty straightforward. Interjections, yelling out, pronouns, replacing a noun. All right, word formation processes. So how new words sort of come to be used or die out. So our acronym is CABIN's back with 3 C's for some reason. So we've got commonization. A brand name becomes the name. We don't use adhesive strips if we cut ourselves. We use band-aids. Archaism, a word that is old, out of use, not in active use. You can still use it. It's still in the dictionary probably, but it's archaism, and the dictionary will actually say this is an archaic word to give you a bit of an indication. Don't go using that word necessarily to be down with the kids because no one will know what you mean. Borrowing, stealing from another language to using our English language. Initialisms is basically, I'm going to read it out to make sure, series of letters that remain a series of letters when read aloud. And I've given a bad example, but VCAA or VCAA. That's an initialism. If you call it VICA, as many teachers do, then that is an acronym. So neologism, new word or new application of an existing word in a different context. Shortening, taking out bits of words to make it short. So instead of refrigerator, fridge. Blends, so 2 fragments of words. So fitspo is fitness inspiration. You're not using the whole word, you're sort of cutting and changing to make a new blend. Acronym, so it makes a new word. So ANZAC, I've never heard anyone say the ANZAC. So it's an acronym. Compounding, combining 2 words, so face and book make Facebook. 2 free morphemes, which are complete words pushed together. Contractions, turning 2 words into one, or using an apostrophe usually. G'day, wouldn't, shouldn't, couldn't, mightn't. And then collocations that always go together. Fish and chips, never chips and fish. If you said we're having chips and fish for dinner, people look at you askance because that's quite a strange expression and not a collocation. Retrieval practice is to help you practice pulling this out. If I was you, I would go to the retrieval practice video. There's just all these sections for all of the subsystems, and I'd go there every now and then and practice, or at least write out the list somewhere, like maybe as a little margin or a bookmark, and then I'd just do the best I could to recall all the acronyms and the meta-language that goes behind them. The more you practice that, the more automatic it will be, and the less you'll probably need the acronyms at all. So we've got CABIN's back with 3 C's. We've got NAV, AM, APIC, PD. So this is the one you don't really need an acronym for. These are your word classes in case you get stuck. You should know them ideally without this. Okay, so this is semantics. We're looking at meta-language and acronyms to help you remember it. Keep in mind, of course, these are my definitions. They're short to fit a slide. They're pretty quick. They're pretty punchy. You should be using the orange textbook to check them yourself. And these acronyms might be useful. They might not be useful, but it's a good way to get you to retrieve the information and to practice kind of the memorized parts that you need to learn. And obviously, towards the end of the year, you should be doing these things pretty natively and pretty easily, and they should be pretty well embedded, but at the start, the acronyms might help. So you'll be developing your own table. Acronym, meta-language, definition, function, and finding an example. The more time you can spend on finding an actual example from the news, from the world, from your life, the easier your section C will be, because that's where you'll actually have to use those examples. So first acronym we've got is SPOIL MAP F. It's the best I could do with the letters we've got. Similarly, comparing two things with like, personification giving animate thoughts, feelings, emotions to inanimate objects. Oxymoron is basically the opposite thing, like a generally specific. Irony is saying the opposite thing that you mean. Lexical ambiguity is just something that happens in text when it's not entirely clear what is being said. Can be due to homophones, homonyms, things that are written the same but could mean multiple things. Can be done on purpose or not on purpose depending on the text, and that's something for you to explore in examples. Metaphor, comparing two things that are disparate, using as typically in the middle to make strong figurative comparisons. Animation, giving life to inanimate objects, ideas, or places. So personification and animation are only slightly different. So animation is for anything doesn't need to be inanimate, so that's kind of the key difference. Pun is just a play on words. Being a vegetarian is a missed steak rather than mistake. Those sort of plays on words, whether you have double meanings or multiple meanings. And figurative language is sort of the umbrella term that all of this fits under. So you can talk about the figurative language used when the simile was employed, and kind of start making metalanguage strings and combinations. Okay, so then we have Kaddish. Connotations are the words that sort of you think of when you hear a word. Antonymy are words that are the opposite. Denotation is the actual dictionary definition, so not the thoughts or feelings or emotions attached to a word, but the actual thing that it means according to the dictionary. Idiom is basically just common phrases: pull your socks up, get your head out of the gutter, all these sort of fixed idiomatic colloquial phrases that we use all the time. Synonymy are words that are related to one another. Hyponymy is the tricky one. So you've got your hyponym, which is the top, or the superordinate as it's sometimes called. That's the top. Hyper sort of means over, and hypo means under, which hopefully is a way you can remember the difference. So you've got your hyponym of colors, and then hyponymy, or your hyponym would be pink, purple, green, something like that. So it's always pictured in a diagram. So just remember, hyper is sort of overexcited, and hypo is under. So hypoglycemic means you don't have enough sugar, for example. And then we've just got E&D, euphemism and dysphemism. Euphemism is a very polite way of avoiding the sort of truth of things. And remember, bodily functions, sex acts, and death are sort of the main items that that need to be euphematized, or euphemisms to be made for them. And dysphemism is just saying that thing directly, or even making it more extreme, making it more blunt. Okay, so quick retrieval practice. We've got E&D. What does that stand for? We've got Kaddish. What does that stand for? What words, what meta-language come from? And then finally, SPOIL MAP F, keeping in mind that the F stands for figurative language, which should make it easy for you to do the rest. Okay, so there's the meta-language that is within subsystems but isn't necessarily friendly to an acronym, so individual concepts usually. So what I want you to do is go back to the tables that you developed for each of the subsystems, and you're just going to add either a second table underneath or a little additional part where these, of course, don't have acronyms. All right, within phonetics and phonology, we've got features of a broad, general, and cultivated accents. For your broad accent, you're basically thinking about your out bush sort of cobber out there with your, you're going a bit bush bashing, picking up some wallabies with your rifle in the back of your ute. So you're hearing the vowel lengthening, and you're hearing a fair bit of elision. So we're taking out a fair bit of the word, the G's and the suffixes of words. We sort of drop those off because we're going to go to the spot over there. And a fair bit of assimilation, so your words sort of seem to run together, and you can see there's not really any real clear breaks necessarily, but I'm not also at the same time not really talking in a big rush. This is my broad accent. Your general Australian accent is basically the one that most of us use. You can think of general features of the Australian accent such as the high rising terminal and the non-rhoticity, which is basically when you think of car, bar, you're not saying car, bar, you're saying car, bar, and you're sort of dropping off the R at the end of most of your words. Cultivated is your relatively posh British accent, where you enunciate everything quite precisely. The cultivated Australian accent is very much uncommon, but in Australian history it was rather common and rather important that we learn about it as well. And also you will need and understanding of the International Phonetic Alphabet, which is pictured in the top right-hand slide of this slide. All right, morphology and lexicology. So we've got function words and content words. So content words is about 90, maybe 95% of the language, and function words are the things that tie it together. So they don't have necessarily an adding to the content function, but they serve important roles in the same way that a conjunction or a comma sort of helps to make the language understandable. Affixation, prefix is at the start, suffix at the end, infix is in between the word, so something that's abso-bloody-lutely fantastic. Sort of you can see there's an additional morpheme added in there. Inflectional and derivational. Inflectional changes the number, the quality, the type, cat, cats. Derivational changes the word, so mad, maddening, different concepts. Then we've got root, bound, and free morphemes. The root is basically one free morpheme that stands by itself, and a bound morpheme is something that can go on the end, such as an ly or an ing. By itself doesn't mean anything, but it can be added to a morpheme to make a new morpheme. Suffixation in Australian English, you're thinking of smoko, tinny, robbie, pollies, tradies, brickies, sparkies. Just our tendency to add suffixes to the end of words that don't necessarily need to be there, and this sort of diminutives is a part of this idea. Morphological patterning, conversion of word class, creative word formation is basically the way, if you go back to morphology, all of those concepts are the way that morphology is patterned. And then lexical choice and patterning is just basically the way the words that you pick within a text, how they all work to create coherence and cohesion, make them stick together and make the text understandable, because it's sort of in a narrow realm and it's consistent with itself and it's on topic that you would expect it to be on. All right, discourse, pretty straightforward. Code switching, switching between dialects or languages. So you might think of your idiolect, your sociolect, and your ethnolect. So for example, if you go home to your third generation Vietnamese household, you'll be more influenced by your ethnolect. So you might be speaking with more of an accent or using different syntactic patterns, those sort of things. Then if you go to hang out with your mates, your teenage cool youth speak fancy friends, you'll be using your sociolect, which is a different code, and then your idiolect is the sort of thing that stays true to you. So switching between those, standard English and non-standard English, is code switching to Aboriginal English and many other forms of English. They're all transitioning from one to the other is your code switching. You also need to know about the conventions of transcription for spoken English. And if you've done a number of spoken discourse texts, then you'll get a pretty good idea of what these are. Lento, allegro, all these patterns. And even if you create a transcript for a text that you think is really interesting, for maybe for section C, an example that you're going to use, it might be worth turning that into a transcript just so you can think about the prosodic features that kind of go to contributing to the meaning of that text. Syntax, all of those have been acronymized, so you're free, and semantics likewise. So all of those have been covered through a long list and ugly acronyms. Okay, so there's other meta-language, which means it hasn't been an acronym and it's not necessarily tied to a system. What you're going to do is develop your entire table, slightly different columns. We've got meta-language definition, function, example, and in practice, the more in the wild this can be, the better, because of course then you can use it in your section C. Essays, what the example you have provided shows about values, attitudes, behaviors, and social purpose is the last column. So you'll see what I mean, but examples of jargon, for example, you'll give gamer language like leet, and then finally what that says about the group membership. So it's about, I would say for that example, you'd be talking about things like skill is the thing that's valued most within that group, and kind of exploring the example that you've given. And the more often you do this, and the more you can think about the broader socio-linguistic concepts, the easier of all of this stuff will be for you in section C and B especially. Okay, so these are big ideas, bigger than the subsystem. They're socio-linguistic, they're applied linguistic, they're sort of how society and linguistics clash together. So you might think this activity is relatively shallow, but you'll be constantly updating each of these sort of ideas and writing paragraphs about them using examples and developing each of these into a paragraph of its own so that you can use these in a section C. So firstly, register is pretty straightforward. We think of it as a continuum from formal to informal. You've got intimate, casual, consultative, semi-formal, static, and also frozen, which is sort of out on its own. And that's something like a welcome to country, which is always the same. Something like when you're getting arrested, the police will always say the same declaration, which are called the Miranda rights. So it's you have the right to remain silent. Those sort of things, they always stay the same. Marriage vows, I do you in the name of the law, all those sort of things that I obviously don't know off the top of my head. And each of these little definitions will be useful when you're exploring register. Overt and covert norms, basically. Overt norms, you think standard English, you're giving the idea of prestige, high socio-economic status, so you're doing well, you're rich, you're well educated, you've got all these sort of things behind you, such as in our top picture. Covert norms is a smaller community, so you're using your covert norms to indicate that you're part of the in-group and you understand, you have the same background, the same nationality, the same understanding, same interests, all those sort of things. Whereas overt norms don't necessarily tell too much about you other than you're doing okay and you understand the way the world works. Standard and non-standard English, very similar. Standard English is the standard English that we use in most places, classrooms, schools, airports, banks. Standard English is the expected form. Non-standard English is everything that falls outside of that. Political correctness, also we call it a non-discriminatory language. Is basically the idea that if we repair and update our language often enough, then we can avoid harming, offending, and insulting people. As you can see in the picture here, we've got Aborigine, Aboriginal, Black, Aboriginal person, Indigenous person, and Black person. So at different times throughout history, each of these terms was more common or more accepted, more politically correct. And I might ask you at this moment to pause for a second and think about which one you think is most politically correct. Jargon. Now, jargon is basically you're within a specific group, you've got an expertise, you know, you're a professor, you're a doctor, you're a mechanic, all those sort of things. And you're using jargon to be precise and to do the work or the hobby that you're most interested in. So I think if you look at the pictures, the best example is a doctor is talking to a nurse and the patient is there. They're not purposely trying to exclude you, but they're in a rush. They've got a lot of stuff to do, so they're going to be saying, you know, using a lot of medical jargon that you might not necessarily understand. Similarly, if you think of when someone's been checking on your teeth, they're going through the L1 is impacted and the yada yada yada, all these things that you don't understand. That's not there necessarily to exclude you, though it does in that situation, but it's for them to be as precise as possible. Similarly, if you went into an IT office and you handed them your laptop and you were able to hang around for 5 minutes and hear them talk about the problems with the device, then you'd see that they'd be using a lot of jargon that you necessarily wouldn't understand unless that's sort of your thing. All right, so slang is very distinctly different from jargon. It's non-standard informal speech used within an in-group. So down the bottom we've got examples: bloke, arvo, Sheila, FIFO, that you're thinking sort of Australian lingo. Mostly, you know, your bogan types would use that more often and sort of to signal to others that they're in that group. Gamer slang, AFK, GG, BG, too easy, Eshe, Adlai, Urching, Itchbays. Then you've got rhyming slang, which I'm currently covering with my camera, but you get a sense that the purpose of slang is that there's sort of a pattern to it, and if you're in the group, you understand the pattern, and the idea being that as soon as someone else works it out, or you know, a teacher or a parent, someone in that kind of position learns the slang, you're going to quickly adopt a new version of slang or change the rules or do something to continue to exclude that group. All right, colloquial language is your working man, your everyday person, the person on the streets language, not overly affected or show-offy or higher register, just the language of the people. In Australia, thinking diminutives, shortenings, assimilated and blexed lexemes and contractions as signals of colloquial language specifically. And at this point, it might be useful for you to sort of think of some of the associations with these words and what they signal about the people participating in using them. So doublespeak is basically purposely obfuscating your language, and you can do that through a whole range of different things, using very euphemistic language, you're just using long run-on sentences that kind of don't necessarily answer the question, but there's a whole different ways of doing it that are listed there, but it's what politicians do and others to kind of sneak out of things or to avoid directly referring to things that are politically damaging or similarly impacting upon their negative face needs in some other way, or indeed positive face needs. All right, taboo language. Typically, we'd talk about death, sex, bodily excretions, all those sort of things. But in Australia, the use of taboo language is quite different. The C word is famously quite common in Australia, where it is highly taboo in many other language groups, in nations as well, I guess. And so you're thinking of profanity, what's profane, and what's sort of out there and too far. It might be interesting to think about what topics you think are especially taboo in Australia. Maybe class isn't that often discussed as it is in apparently the UK or the US, where you would say to someone, what is your job, what car do you drive, sort of upon first meeting them to kind of see where they sit on the ladder. That kind of stuff you could say is sort of taboo language, not necessarily taboo language, but that the topic itself is taboo, and that might be something that you can explore in essay writing. Where are the boundaries around what's taboo and what's not in Australian English? Public language, not sort of the way you speak when you're in public, but specifically, in quite formal, visible, and things that are collected. So the media, politics, all those sort of things. If you're doing a formal speech, you're in the public domain, courts, media, bureaucracy, politics, kind of any places that are on record. So if you're a news reader, you're obviously going to use public language, and that's very much politically correct, non-discriminatory, and all those sort of things, because you're aiming to be as precise as possible and as inoffensive to the broader global public as you can. So rhetoric is basically, if you're in mainstream English, this would be the focus of an entire section of the exam. You'll be looking at rhetoric, which is aiming to convince people of things. Positive and negative face needs. Positive face, you want to be liked, appreciated, valued. You walk into a room, people applaud, that's great. But also your negative face needs is that you wish people would just leave you alone. So between those two, ideally you want to be praised but not imposed upon, and these things are from the politeness theory of Brown and Levinson. All right, situational context. What we talk about: function, field, mode, setting, and relationships. So it's basically who is in the room and how does that affect their language. And so if you want, you could use that as some sort of a rough acronym, FFMSR, or Mr., Mrs. FF perhaps, as a really kind of just a checklist that you might use to talk about situational context. But importantly, you're never going to have a full understanding of situational context. So quite often you'll be looking at the text you're studying and trying to reverse engineer situational context from that, using those 5 features. Cultural context. This is a much bigger one. You can talk about the specific culture within an in-group, but broadly thinking of Australian culture, values, attitudes, and beliefs. And this is definitely something you'll need to develop a great understanding of. So you want to be able to answer a whole range of questions about Australian English. So what does Australian English suggest about Australian culture? We value mateship, egalitarianism, freedom of speech, but we don't like tall poppies, we don't like show-offs, we don't like flogs, we don't like people that are extra, none of those things. So think of the more you can spend trying to get a broad overview of Australian English and it's what it shows about our culture, our beliefs, our attitudes, and our values, the better you'll be come exam time. All right, social purposes. So it's a combination of situational, cultural context, and the goal of the text. And these are directly from the study design. So there's the 5 for the formal and the 4 for the informal language that we basically just need to memorize and be able to recall. Ethnolect is basically, especially in Australia, thinking of Aboriginal or Indigenous languages and how those impact the language spoken, and also waves of migration. So Vietnamese English would be one ethnolect, Macedonian English and many other sort of migrant groups to Australia will speak a slightly different dialect, which we call an ethnolect. All right, sociolect is basically the dialect within your social group. So different rules, gender, aspirations, occupation, interests will inform your sociolect. And your idiolect is basically what you speak, and it's informed by everything that makes up you, including your ethnolect, your sociolect, and all of the things that make up your identity, your nationality, your family background, your upbringing, your class, socioeconomic status. Every part of you informs your idiolect. So everyone has an idiolect, and it is informed by who they are. Okay, so these are all the acronyms for revision for Unit 3 specifically, and also Unit 4 English Language. If I was you, I'd have a blank piece of paper in front of me, or some way of recording your guesses or approximations, or hopefully very much correct answers to these acronyms. And the more you do this, of course, the easier it will be to do later on. And more importantly, the more readily you will be able to retrieve these concepts and be able to use them in your writing. So from discourse, we have CILFCC or SILFCC. Morphology and lexicology, cabins back with 3 C's importantly. From semantics, we've got E and D. From discourse, LC cash. Phonetics and phonology, we've got spit and B. Syntax, I die. Phonetics and phonology, CBL. Syntax, FFEFEW. Phonetics and phonology, RA, RA, and CO. Semantics, Kaddish. Semantics, spoil, map, F. Discourse, Cafe C, cadres. Syntax, double S, triple C, or SSCCC. Phonetics and phonology, EAVI. Syntax, APVPALP. Syntax, SPCA. Morphology and lexicology, NAV, AM, APIC, PD, which probably doesn't need to be an acronym, but hopefully you remember what they are at least. Discourse, DP, IT, AP, OC, or DIPIT, APOC. Syntax, LAP. Discourse, Mr. BP, TT, THP, TM, which is a tough one. Syntax, SVOEEF. Syntax, NEC. And finally, PCS.